Thank you very much. Randolph Kent from King's College. First of all, Martin, if I may just say that I know the book. I've had the opportunity of reading it beforehand. It is such an outstanding reflection and journey. But that said, as we look now into the future, as we begin to start seeing the kind of threats we might have to see, the deep convergence of conflict, natural hazards, technological hazards, etc., what role should the United Nations play? What are the three fundamental changes that might be required to make the United Nations a far more adaptive and anticipatory system? Thank you.
Three? I don't know. One of the strengths of the United Nations is its diversity. The fact that you have a normative organization for health matters like WHO, which is essentially separate from the Secretariat, that you have a specialized program like UNHCR, you have a High Commissioner for Refugees who is in charge of refugees. But since 1991, there has been an emergency relief coordinator. But the clue is in the title. She is the coordinator. She's not the manager of emergency relief. And the emergency relief is actually done by the World Food Programme, UNICEF, UNHCR, and others. She chairs the Interagency Standing Committee, which was established by governments in the General Assembly. But the governments conveniently left themselves out of it. So they instructed the UN and the Red Cross movement and NGOs to coordinate with each other. But big organizations like USAID and the European Commission Humanitarian Office are not part of it. So you have this incredibly fragmented response system. And this means that when a kind of a specialized humanitarian crisis like Ebola emerges, it's not quite clear immediately who is responsible for doing what. And this is some microcosm of a general problem within the UN of mixing normative work, setting standards, setting policies, and managing operational response. And the two don't necessarily go very well together, nor do they necessarily require the same kind of structural arrangements. So perhaps one should envisage one operational agency that does humanitarian emergency response rather than half a dozen. That would be one thing, and I think I'll leave the other two for others to think of.
Other question. By the way, we've had a couple from the floor very much along the same, from the internet rather, very much along the same lines, but Sarah.
Martin, you said reform is possible, and you clearly achieved extraordinary change in a system that is quite resistant to change, through the campaign to ban anti-personnel landmines and with the establishment of UMMAs. What are the key ingredients to effect such change? What were the key ingredients for you that made that change possible?
Well, if I look at the role of the UN Mine Action Service, it's interesting. after I'd been doing that for 5 years and was approaching retirement, a number of people came to see me and said, you know, how do you do it? For instance, some people in DPK, disarmament and demobilization. I think that perhaps the element that most helped was that the person running the coordinating office was the most senior official in the UN doing that type of work. So everybody recognized that we were responsible for coordinating the UN's efforts in the field of mine action. Then we realized pretty soon that we needed a common UN policy on mine action. So we got together representatives of 14 different UN agencies, departments and funds and programs, and we developed a policy document. And then we said to them, all right, you go back and get your heads of agencies to sign off on this, or to suggest amendments, of course. So they went back and amendments were suggested, and it was revised and updated and so on. And finally, the UN policy on mine action was agreed by 14 different organizations at the level of the executive heads of those organizations, not by the directors or the bosses, the Under-Secretary Generals. Then we thought, well, we've got a policy now, let's have a strategy. So we put together in exactly the same way a 3-year strategy with the usual goals and objectives and targets and so on, with each organization responsible for the lead on a particular area of work. And we went through exactly the same process, getting our friends in each agency to take it up to the very top level and get a written, signed, saying, yes, we approve this draft UN strategy. All 14 of them signed it. And there's an interesting little story. The Ottawa Treaty, the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Treaty, has a process of meetings regularly in Geneva. And one delegate who had played quite a major role in the development of the treaty, for some reason never really liked us at the Mine Action Service. He preferred UNICEF and UNDP. So he would actually sometimes try to encourage UNICEF and UNDP to have a different policy from UNMAS and to set up a little rivalry between us within the UN system. Don't be so shocked, this happens all the time. So because we had divided up the tasks very clearly in the policy and the strategy, and because we used to meet every time before we went to a meeting at which we were all representing the different parts of the system in different ways, we knew about this immediately. And so we made it clear, each one of us who spoke said, this statement on behalf of UNICEF is also on behalf of UNMAS and UNDP and the other parties to the UN Mine Action Strategy. So we constantly were going back and ensuring that we had the buy-in of all the other parts of the system. I'm not sure this happens in other sectors, at least not sufficiently.
Okay, we've got some questions online. Let me just ask one of them from Lola Gostolo, who's here somewhere in London, in which she sort of asks the question that given that the UN competes over resources and operational profiles, you've just given an example of it, over landmines, wouldn't it be better to just leave the operations to others and focus just on policy setting?
This is an interesting argument, and I think a case can be made for that. But there is still a but. There's always a but, isn't there? But there are still situations in which NGOs, commercial companies, find it very difficult to operate in a comprehensive way, and sometimes perhaps even in an impartial way. Also, I think it's worth remembering that the UN Mine Action Service is a part of the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and also manages mine action for the department, for the peacekeepers. So some of the countries in which the Mine Action Service is working are countries in which peacekeeping operations are taking place. So it's a part of the peacekeeping operations. But I think you can make an argument for saying, particularly if you take my earlier argument about the development of national capacities, I would certainly like to see a situation where the great majority of work in the field, like mine action, but not only in mine action, is done by organizations born and bred and managed and owned in the countries where the work is being done. And the UN might play a funding, policy, oversight role, rather than actually managing operations.
Any last one, because we're just winding up now. Anyone else? Sir, back.
Martin, I get the feeling, over the years, it seems the difficulty that the UN has is getting the biggest paymaster. Getting its biggest paymaster to contribute properly, which is the USA. Question one is, are you going to have a similar launch of your book in New York? And are you going to tell the Americans some of these same home truths, which are so impressive to this audience?
Well, the answer to the first question is yes, there will be a launch in New York on the 5th of December. And if given the opportunity, I will certainly say to them, but of course, New York is a bit different, because New York is the headquarters of the UN, and that's where the launch will be held. Now, the relationship between the United Nations and the US, I think, Mark, why don't you take that one?
Well, you know, actually, this is going to surprise people who remember a little bit about how I had to defend the UN against a particularly monstrous period in American leadership under George Bush, when he sent John Bolton as his ambassador to the UN, who threatened to cut half the building down because it was unnecessary. You know, and it's sort of earned me a reputation as the sort of great dogged defender of the UN against an overbearing America. But on this issue, actually, America is very generous. I mean, America has always been the leading funder of UNHCR, UNICEF, the Red Cross, etc. Because for Americans, this is much easier than actually the hard spend on development. It's the development bit where they lag horribly. And increasingly in recent years, sadly, it's been on some of the politics around humanitarian operations where, for example, they've put restrictions on UN and international relief workers working, for example, in Gaza, you know, because it's viewed as somehow legitimizing the Hamas regime there. So you know, there are some faults, but actually this is not one of them. They are generous on that, and say, I mean, you know, we've at least until tonight, when I think the Republicans are taking back control of the U.S. Senate, we've gone through a relatively more benign period under President Obama. And as I say, I mean, for me, in a way, yes, America's leadership is imperfect and all the rest, but you know, as big a complaint I take away from the whole system is when the Americans look over their shoulders. You know, they've just given I don't know how many, actually several hundred million, I think, for Ebola in Liberia. When they look over their shoulders, they see us behind them on Sierra Leone, but nobody behind that. And so in a way, I think the challenge is as much to get the rest of the world to step up to its responsibilities as it is trying to persuade America to be a more responsible leader.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Beginning with the French. Yeah. I think last word is yours, Martin.
No, well, I think that's exactly right. Well, if the last word is mine, then I would like to thank you, Mark, for taking us through this very interesting discussion. Thank you all for being interested in it, and encourage you to keep being interested in it, and perhaps also to encourage our elected representatives to be interested in it. But just to be aware that sometimes what we think is happening, maybe it's not exactly like that.
Thank you, Martin.
Just to have the very last word and thank both Mark and Martin for such an interesting dialogue tonight, and your very frank views, Martin, which are always appreciated, and to thank the online audience. But unfortunately you can't make the most of our special offer for Martin's book tonight, which is only £15 from your publisher, and I really encourage all of you to purchase the book, because it's an excellent read. Having read that, I can only recommend it. But thank you so much for being with us tonight, Martin, and thank you, Mark, for moderating the debate. Thank you for you.